The world isn't waiting for permission anymore. While Washington was busy drawing its red lines and threatening civilizations with destruction, a country that most Americans couldn't find on a map a year ago quietly walked into one of the most dangerous geopolitical standoffs of the 21st century and did something that the combined weight of European diplomacy, United Nations resolutions, and decades of American pressure completely failed to do. It brought the United States and Iran into the same building at the same table, talking. Let that sink in for a moment. Not Oman, not Switzerland, not some neutral European capital with chandeliers and centuries of diplomatic tradition. Pakistan, a country that just 1 year ago was fighting its own 4-day war with India, dealing with fuel prices that were skyrocketing past anything its working class could absorb, and managing a delicate balancing act between a mutual defense pact with Saudi Arabia and a 1,000-kilometer shared border with Iran. And yet there they were. Pakistani Field Marshal Asim Munir and Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar moving between the two wings of Islamabad's Serena Hotel through the night, shuttling messages, calling tea breaks to cool down raised voices, keeping both sides in the room when everything threatened to collapse. This is not a minor diplomatic footnote. This is a structural realignment of global power playing out right in front of us, and most Americans are watching the wrong channel. The war that brought all of this to a head began on February 28, 2026, with joint U.S.-Israeli strikes that killed Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and other senior officials. Iran responded with missile and drone attacks on Israel and several Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia. That is where we need to start, because the assassination of a sitting head of state, regardless of how Washington and Tel Aviv characterized the operation, fundamentally changed the rules of the game. You do not kill the supreme leader of a major regional power and then expect that same power to come crawling to the negotiating table on your terms. That is not how sovereign nations behave. That is not how history works. And Iran, despite 40 years of sanctions, despite being bombed, despite watching its proxies dismantled piece by piece, has not forgotten who it is. Pakistan condemned the U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran and the subsequent Iranian attacks on Gulf countries. Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif's government called Khamenei's assassination a clear violation of international law. Now, you might think that's just diplomatic boilerplate, the kind of language that gets issued from foreign ministries and forgotten by morning, but pay close attention to what Pakistan did next, because the words were only the beginning. While publicly condemning the strikes, Pakistan was simultaneously working the phones, working the back channels, working every relationship it had built across a decade of careful, patient diplomacy. Islamabad was not sitting on the sidelines wringing its hands. It was executing a strategy. Pakistan had to maintain its mutual defense pact with Riyadh, signed in September 2025, without being drawn into a direct confrontation with Iran, its southwesterly neighbor, with which it shares a nearly 1,000-kilometer border. Think about the geometry of that problem for a moment. You are a nuclear-armed state. You have a defense agreement with one side of an active shooting war. You share a border with the other side. You have millions of your own citizens working in Gulf states, sending home remittances that are the lifeblood of your economy. Your fuel prices just jumped 40% in a single month because the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed. The dispute triggered an energy crisis in Pakistan by disrupting oil flows in the Gulf, and yet Pakistan did not collapse under the weight of those contradictions. It turned them into leverage. It turned the fact that it had skin in the game on every side of this conflict into a reason why both Washington and Tehran were willing to take its calls. The real breakthrough in the Pakistan-U.S. relationship had happened after a 4-day conflict between India and Pakistan in May 2025. Pakistan appreciated President Trump's role in helping to stop hostilities with India and later formally nominated him for a Nobel Peace Prize. Now, some people will hear that and roll their eyes. Nominating someone for a Nobel Peace Prize sounds like naked flattery. And maybe it was. But in geopolitics, flattery is a tool, relationship building is a tool, and Trump, who genuinely craves recognition and who genuinely believes he is a deal maker of historic proportions, responded to it. That episode opened a direct channel between Pakistan's Army Chief Munir and the White House. Munir visited Washington twice, and Trump publicly praised him on several occasions. Trump acknowledged Pakistan's ties with Iran, telling reporters that Pakistanis know Iran very well, better than most, after hosting Munir for an unprecedented lunch in June. That is not nothing. That is a head of state telling the world that he trusts this man. That is the opening of a diplomatic corridor that did not exist before. On March 26th, Pakistan's Foreign Minister Dar confirmed that the U.S. had shared a 15-point proposal with Iran via Pakistan. It demanded commitments on Iran's nuclear program, limits on its ballistic missiles, and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. 15 points, that is a comprehensive set of demands. And if you read through them carefully, what you find is not a good faith negotiating position. What you find is a maximalist wish list designed by people who still believe, despite all evidence to the contrary, that Iran can be coerced into surrender. The demand for zero enrichment, the demand for limits on ballistic missiles, the demand for an immediate reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz has emerged as the primary issue in U.S.-Iranian negotiations. Opening it is crucial to easing upward pressure on oil prices and instilling confidence in global markets. That is absolutely true. But the United States cannot demand that Iran unilaterally surrender its most powerful strategic card as a precondition for talks. That is not diplomacy. That is capitulation dressed up in negotiating language. The Iranian parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf said that Iran would not give in to surrender terms from the U.S. He accused Washington of sending mixed signals, saying the enemy publicly sends messages of negotiation and dialogue and in secret plans for a ground attack. This is the thing about Iran that Washington has never quite understood, or perhaps has chosen not to understand. Iran has been under American pressure, economic, military, diplomatic, for over 40 years of sanctions, 40 years of being told that you are a pariah, that your government is illegitimate, that your people deserve freedom from their leadership, and Iran is still standing. Its nuclear program is more advanced than it has ever been. Its missile program is more capable than it has ever been. Its regional influence, despite everything, has not been extinguished. You cannot negotiate with a party you do not respect, and you cannot respect a party you do not understand. Iran's counter-demands included controlled passage through the Strait of Hormuz in coordination with the Iranian armed forces, which would mean that Iran retains its leverage over the waterway, an acceptance of Iran's nuclear enrichment program, the lifting of all primary and secondary sanctions and resolutions against Iran, the withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from all bases in the region, and full compensation for damages suffered by Iran during the war. These are not the demands of a country that thinks it lost. These are the demands of a country that believes, with some justification, that it fought the United States of America and Israel simultaneously and survived. That is the Iranian psychology you are dealing with. And until Washington internalizes that reality, no amount of Pakistani mediation, however skilled, is going to bridge the gap. The weekend meeting to resolve the conflict between the U.S. and Iran, held in Islamabad 4 days after the ceasefire announcement, was the first direct encounter between U.S. and Iranian officials in more than a decade and the most senior engagement since Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution. Inside Islamabad's luxury Serena Hotel, the talks unfolded across two separate wings and one common area. One for the U.S. side, one for the Iranians, and one for trilateral meetings involving Pakistani mediators. Let that sentence land properly. The most senior direct engagement between the United States and Iran in nearly half a century, happening not in Washington, not in Tehran, not in some European capital, in Islamabad. In a hotel that Pakistan chose, on a stage that Pakistan set, with Pakistan's army chief and foreign minister physically moving between the rooms, keeping two nuclear-adjacent powers from walking out on each other. During one tense moment, raised voices could be heard outside the negotiating room before Munir and Dar called a tea break and moved the two sides back into separate rooms. Toward the final stages of the discussions, which spilled into Sunday morning, the U.S. delegates were moving between the negotiating room and their private floor far more often than the Iranians. Read that carefully. The U.S. side was moving more. The U.S. side was more agitated. The U.S. side was in more of a hurry. Iran sat. Iran was patient. Iran understood something that Washington has not yet accepted. Time is on Tehran's side as long as the Strait of Hormuz remains even partially closed, as long as oil prices remain elevated, as long as global shipping is disrupted. Every day that the strait does not fully reopen is a day that Iran's fundamental negotiating position gets stronger, not weaker. Tehran appeared to be betting Washington would eventually back down. There is no easy military option here, a former U.S. national security official said. This is the truth that American policymakers do not want to say out loud. You can bomb Iran. You have done it. You can kill their supreme leader. You have done that too. But you cannot bomb a country into giving you what you want when that country has already decided that dignity and sovereignty are worth more than economic relief. Iran watched what happened to Iraq. It watched what happened to Libya. It watched what happened to every country that gave up its deterrent capabilities under American pressure. And it drew the obvious lesson. The only countries that the United States does not ultimately try to regime change are the ones it cannot easily defeat. Pakistan's Field Marshal Asim Munir arrived in Tehran for meetings with Iranian diplomats and Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Araghchi said he was very pleased to welcome Munir to Iran, where he affirmed Iran's commitment to promoting peace and stability in the region. This tells you something critical. Iran is not shutting the door. Iran is not walking away. Iran is engaging with Pakistan in a way that it is not engaging directly with the United States, and that is deliberate. Iran uses Pakistan as a face-saving mechanism. It allows Tehran to appear responsive to diplomatic pressure from a Muslim neighbor without appearing to bow to American demands. The distinction matters enormously in Iranian domestic politics, where any perception of capitulation to Washington can be fatal for any political faction. Pakistan brought Chinese leadership on board, resulting in a joint five-point agenda. China's involvement adds weight to these efforts, given its immense strategic interests in Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. Its global stature and perceived neutrality positions it as a potential guarantor in any agreement. This is where the story gets much bigger than just Pakistan and Iran and the United States. China has strategic interests in keeping Iranian oil flowing. China has strategic interests in keeping the Strait of Hormuz open. China has strategic interests in demonstrating to the global south that there is an alternative to American-led crisis management. When Pakistan brings China into a joint five-point proposal, it is not just doing diplomacy. It is building a competing architecture for global order. It is saying that the United States does not have a monopoly on how international crises get resolved. Pakistan's hedging diplomacy is both a strategic choice and a necessity. Given its geopolitical ties, sectarian dynamics, and economic constraints, Pakistan cannot remain passive or align exclusively with any one side. This is what real-world geopolitics looks like, not the clean binary of allies and enemies that Washington likes to draw, but the messy, complicated reality of a country with a defense pact with Saudi Arabia and a 1,000-kilometer border with Iran, with deep ties to China and an equally deep need for American investment and diplomatic cover. Pakistan's position is not confused. It is calibrated, and the calibration is working in ways that decades of American maximum pressure has failed to achieve. On April 7th, Trump threatened that a whole civilization would die tonight, never to be brought back, if Iran did not reach an agreement with the United States. Later that same day, Trump announced a 2-week ceasefire with Iran. That sequence alone tells you everything you need to know about where American leverage actually stands. You threatened to destroy a civilization, and then hours later, you agreed to a ceasefire brokered by Pakistan. That is not strength. That is the performance of strength masking an underlying reality that the military option has real limits, that the economic costs of a closed Strait of Hormuz are falling on American allies and American markets, and that someone, in this case Islamabad, had to provide a face-saving off-ramp. Iran's parliament spokesman said Iran would not agree to extend the ceasefire if it does not include Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz. There it is. Iran is not surrendering its strategic position. Iran is not giving up the one piece of leverage that gives it genuine power in this negotiation. And every day that the Trump administration's domestic audience hears about gas prices and shipping disruptions and global market instability, that leverage grows. Iran knows this. Pakistan knows this. China knows this. The question is when Washington will fully absorb it. The breakdown of the U.S.-Iran talks in Islamabad highlights a larger truth. Peace efforts fail not just because of where they are held, but because of how far apart the parties remain. That is accurate, but it misses something essential. The fact that talks happened at all in Islamabad, the fact that Vance and Witkoff and Kushner flew to Pakistan, that the most senior American and Iranian officials sat in rooms separated by a Pakistani-mediated corridor, that a ceasefire exists, however fragile. All of that represents a transformation in Pakistan's standing in the world that would have been unimaginable just 2 years ago. Pakistan did not solve the U.S.-Iran crisis, but Pakistan proved that it could convene it. And in the current restructuring of global power, the ability to convene is itself a form of power. What you are watching right now is not just a ceasefire between Washington and Tehran. What you are watching is the emergence of a genuinely multipolar diplomatic ecosystem. One where the old playbook of American dominance and European facilitation has been supplemented, and in some cases supplanted, by new actors who have different relationships, different histories, and different stakes in the outcome. Pakistan is one of those actors. China is another. The Oman Channel still exists. Turkey and Egypt have been part of this conversation. The architecture of international diplomacy is being rebuilt in real time, not in some distant theoretical future, but right now in the hallways of a hotel in Islamabad, in the phone calls between army chiefs and foreign ministers at 3 in the morning, in the quiet, unglamorous, essential work of keeping two nuclear-armed adversaries from turning a ceasefire into a catastrophe. This is what a geopolitical shift looks like from the inside. It does not announce itself with trumpets. It happens in the moments between the threats, in the tea breaks that Asim Munir called to cool down raised voices, in the 5-point proposals and the 45-day truce plans, and the Pakistani flagged ships moving through the strait with Tehran's permission when no other flag could guarantee safe passage. The world is changing. Pakistan is not just observing that change. It is, for the first time in its complicated and often turbulent history, helping to shape it.